Hi everyone, and welcome to another crime and punishment story. This week I am covering the story of George Johnson and the murder of Richard Johnson, which took place in Cowpen Quay in Blyth in 1906. If you are a regular viewer, you will know that I like to try and get location photos where possible. However, with this story, most of the streets mentioned no longer exist, so any photos used will just be of the Cowpen Quay area. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. George Johnson was born in Gateshead in around 1853 and his parents are unknown. He married Emily in 1882 and the couple had 4 children together. George worked as a coal miner and a shipyard labourer, and the family lived together in an area of Blyth known as Cowpen Quay, and they had lived in the same house for around 22 years and were quite well known in the area. At the time of the murder, a very basic description of George appeared in one of the local papers, saying that he was a short man with a greying moustache. It was also said that he had not been working much at the time of the murder and the family had been struggling to survive. Emily was also quite ill and mostly confined to bed. Richard Johnson was born in Blyth in around 1883 and he was the oldest son of George and Emily Johnson. In 1906 he was working as a shipyard labourer, having previously worked as a cartman and night scavenger, which is basically someone who would empty the toilet areas in the various streets of the town during the night. In comparison to his father, Richard was described as being a tall, powerfully built man, and someone who was fond of the drink, which often made him violent. It would seem that Richard did not have a very good relationship with his father, though no real reason is given for why the pair do not seem to get along, although money did seem to be a factor and they would frequently argue and fight. On the afternoon of December the 15th, 1906, Richard left the house to head off to the Blyth versus Bedlington football match. That would be Blyth Spartans. Before he left, the neighbours heard an argument taking place in the home of the Johnsons in Salisbury Street in Cowpen Quay. But because it was quite normal for Richard and George to argue, no one took much notice of the argument and it stopped when Richard left. Later that day, Richard went to a couple of the public houses in the Cowpen Quay area before heading home when the earlier argument resumed. It wasn't long before George left the house to look for a policeman, returning with one a short time later. The policeman was not able to remove Richard from the house, but he did advise him to leave, which he did. However, he returned a short while later and the argument began again. This time George left the house and returned a few moments later with 2 policemen. Again Richard was advised to leave and not return, and again he left. However, it seems that Richard had no plans to let the argument end, as he returned to the house a 3rd time. He was able to sneak in when his sister let her friend out, and he locked the door behind him, and this time the argument turned into a physical fight with his father. A few moments later, Isabella, a cousin of the family who lived with them, was shouting "murder" from one of the windows. A man by the name of John Martin was in the area and heard the cries of murder. Running down to the house, he forced his way inside to find George standing in the kitchen wiping his hands on a towel. George told him to go and see Richard, and when John entered the bedroom he found Richard lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and the police and the doctor were sent for. When they arrived, George told them he had done for Richard, saying it was either him or me. On examining the body, Dr. Cromie found several wounds to Richard's head, and it was clear that he was already dead. An axe was found in the kitchen, which appeared to PC Story to be the murder weapon. George was then charged with the willful murder of his son and taken to Blyth police station. George's wife was taken to a neighbour's home along with his daughter. No detail is given as to where Isabella, the cousin, went, but it is to be assumed that she went to the neighbours with the rest of the family. I did not find any full details of the inquest. However, I did find details of a special court hearing where the information would be very much the same as what would have been heard at the inquest. And the special court hearing was held at Blyth Police Courts on Wednesday, December the 26th. George Hemsley of Cowpen Quay said he had identified the body as being that of Richard Johnson, who was 24 years old and was a shipyard labourer. He said that he was no relation to Richard. It's not clear why a family member did not identify the body, but as Richard's mother was ill and his sister was only 16, perhaps it was thought better to find someone else to do it. John Martin said he had been in the area on the night of the crime and had rushed to the house after hearing a woman shouting murder from a window. After breaking down the door, he entered the bedroom and saw Richard lying on the floor. When asked, he said he had moved the body, picking Richard up and placing him on his back with his head on a pillow. On returning to the kitchen, he saw George Johnson still wiping his hands on a towel. At this time, he did not see the axe, but some moments later, George picked it up. John said he had asked him to hand it over, which at first he did. Then he took it back again. After this, John said it was given it to Mary Johnson, and she later gave it to the police. He said that when the police arrived, he left and he knew no more after this. Mary Johnson said she was 16 years old and the prisoner was her father. She said along with her mother, father, brother Richard and cousin Isabella Robertson, she lived in Salisbury Street in Cowpen Quay, and their home consisted of a kitchen and one bedroom. She said both her father and brother worked as labourers at the Blyth shipyard, and her brother had been at work early Saturday, but her father had not. Her father had not worked much at all recently. Her brother, she said, had returned home around 1:45 p.m. She said he had argued with her father, but she did not say what about. Richard had then left to go to the football match, and she did not see him again until he returned home around 7 p.m. She believed he had been drinking, but she did not think him to be drunk. She left the house with her friend after this and did not return until around 8:30 p.m. Richard was not there at this time, and her friend went home around 9:30 p.m. and as she was letting her out, her brother rushed into the home. He then turned and locked the door, placing the key in his pocket. She said that they were all in the bedroom and her father told Richard to go to bed, but he said he would go when he had finished with him. She knew her brother wanted to fight, so she left the room. Her mother and her cousin tried to stop the fight, but Richard sent them both out into the kitchen. She then went back into the bedroom where she saw her father and brother standing by the fireplace. Richard had his back to her and her father had an axe in his hand. She was again sent out of the room. She did not hear any argument, but she knew that something was very wrong. Isabella was shouting murder from the window, and a man she now knew as John Martin burst in the door because of the cries of murder. She said by now her father had come into the kitchen with the axe in his hand, and he had told her, "I have done it now, send for the police and the doctor," and she said that Isabella had gone to fetch them. She was then shown an axe which she identified as being the one her father had been carrying when he came into the kitchen. When asked, she said her brother had taken to the drink for quite some time, and it had a bad effect on him. Her father, she said, had not drank much that day, but he was always jolly and happy when he had been drinking. Her brother was always in the mood for a fight when he had been drinking. She said that her father had not wished to argue with Richard and that he had seemed afraid of him, and she added that Richard had attacked her father many times before, once trying to strangle him, and that he had tried to strangle him that night as well, and he had also pushed her mother, but she believed only to make her leave the bedroom. Isabella Robertson said George Johnson was her uncle, and that she lived with the family at Cowpen Quay. She had been present in the house the entire night. She said Richard had come home from the football match with drink in him and wishing to continue the earlier argument. She said the argument had been mostly verbal and George had been able to keep Richard away from him. He had left the house to look for a policeman and had returned with PC Spratt, and he had told Richard to leave the house and he had done so. Shortly after this, she said there had been a knock at the door which George had locked. She asked who it was and recognised Richard's voice. She told George he was at the door and he told her to open the door as he could defend himself. She said at this point George had a poker in his hand. She let Richard in and he immediately went for George. She followed them into the bedroom where she said her uncle threw down the poker and went past Richard and out of the house, and he returned shortly after this with 2 policemen. She said her cousin was now sitting by the kitchen table crying, and when the policeman told him to leave the house he said he would go, which she said he did, and the 2 policemen also left. After this, her uncle sent her for some beer, and all was quiet until Mary let her friend out later that night and Richard came back in. She said he put the key in his pocket and she asked him to give her the key, but he said, "No one will get that." He then went into the bedroom where George was sitting and said, "This is the man I want." He then rolled up his sleeves as if about to fight. She said her aunt, who had been ill in bed, had got up and tried to get between the 2 men, but Richard had pushed her away. She was then told to get out of the bedroom. She said it had been she who had shouted murder out of the window, and less than 10 minutes later someone had broken down the door. She said at the same time George came out of the bedroom carrying an axe. She asked him what he had done and he said, "I have killed him, I have done for Richard." After this, she went to fetch the police and the doctor. When asked, she said she also felt drink had had a bad effect on Richard, and that when he had been drinking he always wanted to fight with her uncle. She believed her uncle had told him several times that night to leave the house, but he had not done so until the police had been called. She said earlier that night George had been holding some meat for the cat in his hand, and Richard had pushed it into his face, then pushed George down onto the bed and tried to strangle him. She said Richard had told George, "You have food for the cat, but you are starving us." She said they often argued over money. She said her aunt had been in bed at the time and this had stopped Richard going any further. And she also claimed she heard Richard say it is either him or me, meaning his father. She said she had also heard George say a similar thing earlier on the night of the murder. George Clark said he lived in Regent Street in Cowpen Quay, and he had been called to the house of George Johnson at around 9:45 p.m. on the night of the murder. He said he had seen the body of Richard Johnson lying on the floor in the bedroom. PC Story had asked him to look after George, and he said they had sat down together and had a smoke. George had told him it was either him or me. He had a poker and had head-butted me. George then said he had taken an axe and hitten him on the head with it. Mr. Clark said George did not say much more after this. When asked, he said he had not seen the axe and had not asked George any questions about it. He also said George had not told him anything about intending to kill his son. PC Story said he had been called to the house by Isabella Robertson. On his arrival he found quite a large group of people in the house, but no one would tell him what had happened. He found the body of Richard lying in the bedroom in a pool of blood, and he could see wounds to his head. He was not certain that Richard was dead, but the doctor who arrived just a short time later said he had died almost immediately after the attack. He did not notice any signs of a struggle in the room. He then took George to Blyth police station where he was charged with the murder of Richard Johnson. He said George spoke only to say, "It was either him or me, and I came off the conqueror. I only had 2 children left, and I suppose I only have 1 now. The only thing I am sorry for is my wife and my poor daughter, and I guess my wife will soon be a widow." PC Story said he had found the key to the door of the home in the hip pocket of Richard Johnson's trousers. PC Burns said he had been present when George was taken to the police station, and he confirmed the details given about what George had said to be correct. Dr. Cromie said he had been called to the house on the night of December the 15th at around 10 p.m. On his arrival, he had seen the body of Richard Johnson lying on the floor in the bedroom. He was lying on his back with his head on a pillow. On examining him, he realised at once that he was dead. He had several wounds to his head, all quite deep. He said along with Dr. Manners he had performed the post-mortem on Richard Johnson. They had found that the axe wounds had penetrated the skull and caused bleeding to the brain. He also said that it had been noted that the stomach contents contained a lot of alcohol. He said it was his opinion that death had been caused by the wounds to the head, leading to the bleeding on the brain, and that Richard would not have survived long after the attack. Dr. Manners said he had examined George Johnson at Blyth Police Station, shortly after he arrived. George had complained of pain to the thumb, head and neck. However, apart from a small wound to his thumb, Dr. Manners said he could find no other signs of injury. He said George had told him he must have caught his thumb with an axe. George had told him that he had had little to drink that day, but his son had had more, and had been very troublesome, and that he had had to seek help from the police twice to deal with him. P.C. Spratt spoke of George asking him to come to his house to remove his son. He said on their arrival George had spoken to his son, saying, "I have brought the police with me. You will have to leave now. You have knocked one of my teeth out, though there was no evidence of that, and tried to strangle me. If I had been a bigger man like you, as old as I am, I would squeeze the life out of you." P.C. Spratt said one of the women in the room replied to George's remarks by saying, "Aye, but you had a poker in your hand. You could have felled Richard with that." He did not reply to this, only to say to his son, "Get your coat and go out of this house with the officer." After this, P.C. Spratt said he left the house along with Richard. P.C. Burns said he was called to the home of the Johnsons by George on the night of the crime. He had been in the company of P.C. Spratt. Again, Richard had been asked to leave the house, which he had done. He did not appear to be sober, but did not argue about leaving. Sergeant Tuff said he had cautioned George at Blyth Police Station on his arrival. He said George had made no comments. He had also examined the house and found little to no signs of a struggle in the bedroom, other than some broken glass near to the fireplace and a broken tumbler on the mantelpiece. This was the end of all the evidence given, and the magistrates retired to discuss the case in private, and on their return it was announced that they had unanimously decided to reduce the charge to one of manslaughter, and George Johnson was committed for trial. Although full details of the inquest were impossible to find, as I did say earlier, the results were detailed, and the jury at the inquest also reached a verdict of guilty of manslaughter. The funeral of Richard Johnson took place at Cowpen Cemetery a few days after the murder, and the service was conducted by the Reverend Stock of Cowpen Quay. It was said that huge crowds gathered to watch the procession from the home of the Johnsons to the cemetery. The service itself was a simple one, attended by many of Richard's workmates. His mother, Emily, was still seriously ill and was not able to attend. I did not find any details of a headstone for Richard. The day before the funeral, George was taken by a cab to Newcastle Prison. As was often the case, large crowds gathered outside of Blyth Police Station in the hope of catching a glimpse of the prisoner leaving. The trial took place at the Moot Hall in February of 1907. George pleaded not guilty to the charge. Somewhat similar to last week's story, much of the evidence given at the trial was the same as had been given at the inquest and the special court hearing. The defence were hoping to prove this to be a case of self-defence, and George would give evidence on his own behalf. However, before this it was noted that Richard had previously spent time in prison in 1902 for an attack on a woman in the Cowpen Quay area. It was said that while Richard had been working as a night scavenger, he had been accused of attacking a lady by the name of Jane Harrison. She had been to the railway station to meet her daughter, and on her way home Richard and his friend Thomas Loftus had met her and began walking with her back towards the town. Both men had been drinking, but Richard was said to be quite drunk. She had asked them to leave her alone, but it was alleged that Richard put his arm around her neck and at one point pushed her to the ground. As she was very near to her home, she shouted for her husband, who luckily heard her cries and came to her rescue. Richard, when arrested, had tried to claim that some other person had attacked Mrs. Harrison and that he was simply trying to save her. However, his friend Thomas told a different story, saying he had tried to pull Richard off the woman as he thought what he was doing was wrong. Richard was found guilty and sent to prison for 3 months. It was clear that this information was included at the trial in the hope of painting Richard as a somewhat drunken and violent man. After this, George spoke of the night of the murder. He said on the night of the crime at around 7 p.m. he had fought with his son at their home. He had been frightened of Richard and had escaped to the kitchen, but he had followed him and they had struggled together again. After this, he was able to get out and fetch a policeman to the house. He said his son returned a short while later, and this time he, George, picked up a poker to frighten him. He dodged him by running round a table and went out again to fetch the police. But he said his son returned a third time. He had been in the bedroom and Richard walked in, swearing at him and saying, "I have got you now." After forcing his mother, sister and cousin into the kitchen, he said Richard had grabbed him by the throat and pushed him against the wall. He had feared for his life, and on seeing the axe he picked it up, and while Richard was still squeezing his throat, he hit him several times on the head with the axe. It was, in his opinion, the only way to make him let go. He said Richard then fell to the floor. He said he had been terrified that Richard was going to kill him. The defence then spoke of George being so frightened of his drunken, angry son that he had simply grabbed the first thing to hand. He had not meant to kill him, merely to make him let go of his stranglehold and perhaps to frighten him. He felt that George had been justified in using any method he could to save his own life. The jury retired for 20 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty. This, it would seem, was quite a shock to George, as he was visibly relieved, and at this George Johnson was discharged and was free to go home to his family. And he quite clearly did return to his family, as he could be found living with his wife and daughter in the same area in 1911. And I did not find any details of him after this date. This was an incredibly tragic story. It is clear from the details that Richard was known to be fond of the drink and had shown many signs of violence in the past. Perhaps he felt, as his father had not been working at the time and the family was struggling, that his father was lazy and he should be taking better care of his wife and children. And although that is no excuse for attacking his father, we also know that when in drink people could and did do some very foolish things, and he ended up paying for that foolish thing with his life. Was the jury right to find George not guilty? Well, this one I am unsure of. It was a pretty vicious attack. There are even reports suggesting that after Richard had fallen to the floor, George had hit him again when he was basically dying. But perhaps he truly was acting in extreme fear, which again can make people do things they would not normally do. But what do you think? Do you think it was a clear case of self-defence? And do you think it was right that George was found not guilty? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.